everyone, and welcome to this episode of Freedom Hub's Working Group. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with Charles Frohman. We are being sponsored by the Freedom Hub and the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom, and we are, in fact, the Disruptors Intersection. We're just trying to make sure everybody meets each other and make this place a little bit better. We're recording these for posterity. There's the link to register to find out about these ongoing. And then any of your favorite channels, we're on there. And in fact, if you do us a favor, go to every one of them and subscribe, because we want the traffic and the trending. And you can be sure that some of these platforms like to suppress people with minimal subscribers. So even though the topics are great and draw good attention, we like to get some more traffic with them. So I appreciate that. And we actually run a couple of other shows. If you're feeling inclined, similarly, we run one Wednesdays at 7 Eastern about cash in the world of medicine, which is really a fast growing and spectacular area. And then the one on the right, which is accelerating financial freedom. Well, that's, guess what, about people not knowing works, and there's nowhere teaching you that, no school, no anything, because there's no money in it for them if you knew any of this stuff. So this is the place to really kind of set your money free. So you really will enjoy that. And you can visit us at our main website. So let's take a quick gander there for 2 seconds. Here we are at the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom. There's some fantastic stuff on all these different drop downs. You'll certainly want to. But in terms of for today, if you come and hover over the home tab, you'll see the webinar tab. And if you scroll over to that a second, you'll see that we definitely have a nice little page set up for that purpose. It lists the current weeks, and here we can see who we are right now on Wednesday at 4 with Kurt, and then what we've got coming up a little later with David, and then also the one that we talked about for your financial one, and that's listed here too. And then here after that are the people coming up, because there's always some great stuff in the pipeline. And lastly, here's all those links again. So all you just have to do is come to the website and click on any of these. First of the week, last week's videos are up. Now, one of the last real thing before we leave out of here and get going today, we do have a lot of people that are fighting for us out there, and our freedom is really important. And it's seemingly either in danger or not in danger from 1 minute to the next, but it's important to understand what's going on. And we do list a lot of very important things you want to take advantage of in terms of advocacy. And I hate to report that you really do need to kind of click on every one of these until these problems go away, and then we take them down. And then just as you can see, there's a lot of organizations that are trying to make things right. And so this is the place to come to find out about what all of them are up to without having to try to search all over the web. And then we definitely have some added articles and videos and the like. So you'll see there's a lot of really good stuff in here. So you'll certainly enjoy coming back to visit. And we thank you for being here today. And now I'm going to stop sharing and shift off to our guest today. Oh, wait, I got ahead of myself for a minute. Let's go back for a second. I wanted Charles to do a little introduction. Apologize, Kurt. I was going to hand the football off just a little too quickly. Charles, can you do the honors?
Sure. Let's figure out who we're actually having present today. Kurt Couchman is a longtime legislative professional in the world of DC government and around the politicians there, working with trade associations, think tanks, members of Congress. Of particular note, he was a government affairs staffer at the Cato Institute, which is a place I worked at before he did. So that's a great experience. I know it is, and I'm sure Kurt would echo that sentiment. Very connected, respected. He also worked for Congressman Amash in his past, who really got a following for his, pure desire to follow the Constitution with every vote, and it really got him involved with a lot of issues, and it really grew his expertise, I'm sure. He's worked at a defense outfit looking at, defense spending and policy. And currently he's with a bipartisan group called Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is important because for anyone that's been around governments and advocacy, one recurring problem are the annual budget deficits, which aggravates the total national debt. And whether it's defense spending or tax cuts from the right, or entitlement spending and welfare from the left, or even all the special interest earmarks in the appropriations bills, it's just so hard to cut spending or have, you know, adequate tax revenue in DC. So that's what we're going to hear from Kurt today about, Jeff.
Okay, well, that'll certainly be good, especially from his background. He's going to give him a great perspective, I am sure. So, Kurt, I've stopped sharing and put you in the driver's seat.
Well, thanks very much for having me here. I'm excited to share some perspective on the federal debt, the deficits, how we've gotten here, where it's going, and how we might be able to make it all work at least a little bit better. Let me just set up the slideshow here, and then we'll get rolling. Okay, are we looking good? Great.
Looks good.
All right, so I want to start with why you should care about the debt. What are the consequences for everybody? The first thing that you should be aware of with the debt is that it actually reduces our prosperity. It does so by something called crowding out, and basically all that means is when the government is consuming loanable funds, that is other people's savings, just to pay the bills for a year, then that money isn't available to finance new plant and equipment for businesses. It isn't available for people to build homes as much. It isn't available to finance the innovation that makes us more prosperous. Over time, that can have a significantly negative impact because of, you know, if you have a small reduction in the growth rate over a period of time, the compounding effects of that small year-on-year change can add up to be pretty significant. It's being masked right now because of other kind of global factors that are going on that we'll get into in a bit, but this government borrowing does increase interest rates. It increases the demand for funds. And if the supply isn't keeping up, and it has been keeping up the last couple of decades, which is why we have low interest rates, but there's still an effect. The interest rates are higher than they otherwise would be because of all this borrowing that governments are not only doing, but also encouraging and subsidizing. Eventually, this means that there will be higher government interest rates. If the debt is high for any given level of interest rate, then the interest costs will be high. And that means that it's that much harder to finance, you know, new priorities, which could be tax cuts, it could be new spending programs, whatever it is that the public and Congress prioritize. It's harder to do that when there's higher interest payments. Emergencies are another thing where it matters. Right now, we're going through a pandemic emergency. If we had a debt burden like what Japan has right now, it would be even harder to support that. Of course, there's a lot of questions about what the best way to support the economy and households and businesses during an emergency are. But sometimes there are emergencies, and part of responsible budgeting is providing for emergencies and making sure that you have that space to be able to provide for emergencies. The entitlement programs that a lot of people rely on in retirement in particular, there's a lot of uncertainty about in what form they will be there in the future, and that affects both people who are working now and people that are already retired and using these programs, and that has impacts on what people can expect for the future. And eventually, if we don't get the debt under control, if investors start to lose confidence in the US dollar as a place where they can park their money and keep it safe, then we could experience a fiscal crisis that could unfold very quickly. People that say, oh, we'll have plenty of time, that's not typically how it works in history. Typically, the debt doesn't matter until it does, and then it's the only thing that matters. Okay, the situation was not great when President Trump was about to take office 4 years ago. You can see that there was an upward trajectory at that point. But stepping back a little bit, if you look at the very left-hand side of the screen, so this is a chart of the debt to GDP ratio. So it's a comparison of the total amount of debt held by the public, by the federal government, to the size of the economy. In the very beginning, 1940 to 1945, 1946, you see the debt spiking pretty significantly. Obviously, that's World War II. The debt peaked as a percentage of GDP at 106% in 1946, and then mostly through a series of inflation and economic growth with favorable demographics, that declined pretty precipitously. Yes, there was some fiscal responsibility, but it was really the inflation and the economic growth that drove that level down, down, down until the mid-70s. Then, as you see, the Great Society program starting to take place and Social Security expansions occurring with disability. It increased again until the end of the Cold War. We had a peace dividend. We had a great tech boom during the Clinton administration, and the debt fell again. Then we had the post 9/11 conflicts and the Great Recession. And at that point, the technology shock had sort of worn off. And if you sort of ignore that dip from Clinton and Bush, there's almost a straight line from Carter, Reagan, Bush 1 to latter Obama and Trump. And so that's really the impact of, we'll get to it more, but an aging population and excess growth in healthcare costs. So we're entering uncharted territory. The demographics are not favorable to us in the same way that they were right after World War II. And so much of this is related to old age programs that are not going away, unlike World War II, which thankfully did go. We are unfortunately also internationally an outlier. These are basically the OECD countries, the well-developed countries in the world. And this is from an IMF report. They were looking at the projected change in the debt over a 5-year period from 2019 to 2024. And you see Portugal and Ireland were expected to reduce their debt to GDP ratio by 16 and 12 percentage points. And all the way on the other side, you've got us with Italy. But we're almost twice as bad as Italy, with the debt projected to rise by 11 percentage points as a percentage of GDP. This is all pre-pandemic. These numbers all need to be updated. But the point is, before the pandemic even happened, we were already in a very precarious fiscal trajectory, and we needed to change course then. We still need to. It's hard to do while the pandemic emergency is still going on, but we will need to figure that out as the pandemic subsides, and fortunately there's light at the end of the tunnel. This shows it a different way. This is the nominal debt, or sorry, the nominal deficits on a year-by-year basis. As the economy recovered from the Great Recession, and as Congress put the brakes on some things that happened during that time, we got down to only $400 billion a year, roughly, of deficits, which if we had been able to kind of sustain there, then the debt as a percentage of GDP would have continued to fall. But that didn't happen. We've been increasing the deficits on a year-by-year basis. And again, this is pre-pandemic. This is the March 2020 baseline from CBO, which did not incorporate any projections about the impact of the pandemic on our fiscal situation. So that's what it was before all this took place. And some of the things that contributed to that, whatever else the policy merits might have been, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, the Bipartisan Act of 2019, repealing the Cadillac tax and some other pieces from the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and then a couple other things. They collectively added about $4 trillion to the debt trajectory. So that's a pretty substantial change. When you compare that to what the deficit would have been absent those things taking place, you can see that in 2019, 2020, and 2021, that roughly doubled what the deficit would have been. And that little gray area about the deficit absent legislation, that is essentially the baseline is. The baseline assumes current law. They assume that, tax provisions expire as they're scheduled to in law. They assume that certain spending programs will expire as the law says they will, even though Congress keeps, extending them. They assume that discretionary spending, which includes defense and transportation and a bunch of other things, will only grow with inflation rather than with the economy, which is a little bit faster. And then they didn't assume a pandemic. They didn't assume that there might be another war. They didn't assume that interest rate shocks might happen. So it's not exactly a totally rosy scenario, but it's a pretty rosy scenario. And because of the legislative actions that have been taken, that those levels basically doubled. Our view at CRFB is that if something is worth doing, then it's worth paying for. And there's a whole raft of different options that you could use to offset this legislation. We've developed a budget offsets bank with some of those options. They span everything from reducing spending on entitlement programs and lots of other spending programs to raising revenue in lots of different ways. We don't have an official position on what specifically Congress should use to offset new priorities. We just say that whatever your priorities are, you need to finance your higher priorities by offsetting through lower priorities, making adjustments there. So then we had the pandemic. This orange line on the left turning into the blue line on the right, that's that pre-pandemic trajectory of deficits. The orange line on the right side, the orange line that spikes way up, that was CBO's September projection of $3.3 trillion of deficit for fiscal year 2020. A huge number. We've never seen nominal numbers like that. As a percentage of GDP, I believe it was maybe dwarfed or maybe second only to World War II, but it might have even been higher than that. But in any case, it ended up being only $3.1 trillion, but it's huge. And then this is again CBO's current law baseline. It drops down. CBO projects that it would be lower, in fact, than the pre-pandemic baseline. Most of that change is due to a weaker economy, weaker job growth, and lower inflation that reduces some program costs, but especially reduces their projected path for net interest costs. We've re-estimated that with what we call an alternative fiscal scenario, where we basically just assume that Congress will extend the things that Congress has always extended, and that gets you the red line. But we do use CBO's interest rate projections and other economic projections. So the notion that it's coming back down to the pre-pandemic baseline, at least temporarily, is really premised on economic weakness and low interest rates, rather than any sort of fundamental restoration of the pre-pandemic status quo. Switching from deficits to debt, this is the same graph essentially, but in terms of the debt instead of deficits. You remember we talked about how the previous record was 106% of GDP. Well, we're on track to exceed that next year. And again, this shows between the orange and the red line, the difference between CBO's current law baseline and what we project would happen if Congress just extended things that Congress always extends. Now, it might seem at first glance to be comforting that the slope of the orange and to a lesser extent the red lines are less than the slope of the blue line. It's not comforting, and the next slide will show you why. But just looking at the levels, you can see that 98% of GDP that the debt was not supposed to hit until about 2030, we've already hit that. We've already passed the 100% threshold of debt to GDP, and we're going up from here. So we've already basically burned up a decade of time in response to the pandemic, much of which may have been necessary, depending on your perspective on that. But here's why you shouldn't be comforted by the difference in the slope. Because GDP dropped by about 10% in the second quarter of 2020. It was a huge shock. And because of that, it's going to take some time for the economy to rebound. This is CBO's projections. Reality may be somewhat different, but the point is that with the economy growing at a faster rate over the next roughly decade, that makes it look like the debt to GDP ratio, or it actually does make the debt to GDP ratio kind of flatten out. But meanwhile, the debt is growing, but the economy is growing at a closer rate than it would have been. So don't take comfort in that lower slope. The debt is still on a really dangerous course. Looking at what Congress actually did through legislation to respond to the pandemic, that's what this shows. There were also executive actions that occurred. For example, there was a delay in when taxes were due to be filed. Instead of April 15th, it was pushed to July. There was a payroll tax deferral that the administration pursued under the Stafford Act, which is supposed to be for kind of kinetic emergencies like tornadoes, hurricanes, that kind of thing. Not really a pandemic, but as is so often the case in statute, the language is a little bit unclear, and that wiggle room was enough that they sought to use it. Also, the Federal Reserve, we'll get to them in a minute, the Federal Reserve was authorized to and otherwise also use some facilities to provide some support to folks. But this is just from the legislation. There were direct payments, unemployment, some tax provisions, some of which were the delays in tax filing. There were a number of loan provisions that were provided. Much of that, about half of that, or a little less than half of that, is expected to be forgiven. So essentially those loans convert into grants, but then there are also items that were initially conceived of as being grants and doled out that way. And then there's a bunch of other spending that doesn't fit neatly in the other categories, but also happened. And then on the right side, you can see the different recipients. Households get the largest single chunk, but then large businesses, if you combine that with the specific stuff for the airline industry, pretty close. And the small businesses got another chunk of about that same size. State and local governments have gotten a little less than $200 billion, but of course, the funding that went out to households and businesses also bolstered state and local payroll and property, or sorry, not payroll, income and sales tax and property taxes. So there were some indirect effects for state and local governments there. Obviously, health providers during a pandemic, that was something that Congress was going to do. $2.3 trillion overall anticipated cost in the legislation. It was a big response. The interesting thing about that is that when you go from the first quarter to the second quarter, you see that market income, less taxes, so post-tax market income, you know, what you get from your job less what you pay in your taxes, did decline from the first quarter to the second quarter. Government transfers, so think about Social Security and a bunch of other things, those, you know, didn't change that much. The government transfers, they're kind of based on formula in law. But when you add in the income that people received from unemployment, from the checks, the so-called recovery rebates, and then the Paycheck Protection Program and other sorts of COVID response legislation, it actually increased household income by about 10%. That has waned a bit in the third quarter and the fourth quarter, and we'll see what happens. But also the unemployment rate has declined. So, and that is certainly not even by states. Hawaii still has a very high unemployment rate. About last time I checked, and then like Nebraska on the other end of the spectrum is down to about 3% unemployment rate. So very different experiences on a state-by-state basis. But in any case, income actually rose initially at the household level. Of course, that's all borrowed funds. I won't go in great detail through that. This kind of walks through how the deficits were projected to change from the March 2020 pre-pandemic baseline to the September 2020 baseline from CBO. The short version is in 2020, fiscal year 2020, which ended September 30th, it went from a projection of $1.07 trillion of deficit to $3.3 trillion deficit, so a $2.2 trillion increase. It ended up being 3.1, but that's still huge. And then the 2020 to 2030 deficit increase went from $14 trillion of additional deficits, add that to your debt, to a little over 16 trillion. So a big changes there. The COVID relief legislation was most of that. It was, $2.8 trillion. But then the economic changes, those lower interest rates filtering through into lower debt service costs and some other factors like that, reduced the expected deficit by over $1 trillion. And then there were some technical changes that partially offset that. So it's a big mess. The low interest rates may not last. We'll get into that. I don't think they'll last. And the curious thing is that so much of that change, that 2 point whatever trillion dollar increase in the deficit, so much of that was financed by the Federal Reserve. If you just look at 2020, you can see that it increased from, somewhere around $4 trillion at the beginning, or maybe at the end of, all the way up to around $7 trillion, just shy of $7 trillion. So $3 trillion deficit increase. If you just look from February, sorry, not deficit increase, Fed balance sheet increase. So just comparing from February 26th, when the pandemic got real, to August 12th, that right there is almost $2.75 trillion that the Fed expanded its balance sheet. Looking back in time a little bit more, all the way at the start of that chart, you see that the Fed's balance sheet was less than $1 trillion in 2008. It's now 6 and change. And the composition has also changed pretty significantly. It used to be that it looks like about 3/4 of the Fed's balance sheet were these low risk, low yield treasuries, very stable asset. And they had a little bit of various other things. During the financial crisis in 2008, that bumped up quite a bit. And then subsequently, their portfolio included quite a bit of mortgage-backed securities. They started to unwind that a little bit in 2019 and 2020, but then, it's kind of hard to see just because of the difference that the U.S. Treasuries kind of takes off during that time period. But then the Fed also bought, a number of other things. They've been authorized to buy municipal bonds. They've been authorized to purchase debt from a number of companies. And that's a different thing. That's not something they did as much of before. So we'll have to see whether that's going to be problematic in the long run. Since we're talking about that nexus between fiscal and monetary policy, I call these siren songs. Modern monetary theory, it has been a fringe theory on the far left. It seems to be making inroads on the political left now. And then also not MMT, but kind of a pernicious doctrine that seems to have some bipartisan support at this point about low interest rates persisting forever. So Stephanie, the foremost exponent or expounder of modern monetary theory. It's basically the idea that as long as a country borrows in its own money, then it doesn't have to worry about inflation, certainly hyperinflation, but even more generic inflation. And so just go ahead and spend So, the idea is basically to take inflation control out of the hands of a sort of independent Fed and give it to Congress, which, doesn't seem to have as much backbone as the Fed even. So, seems risky. If you look in comparative international political context, this is really nothing more than warmed over Latin American populism. It was especially tried under Juan Perón in Argentina. You get a couple of good years, and just when flowing through the system, and then once inflation kicks in, it all falls apart, and people end up significantly poorer than they were before the monetary experiment started. This has been happening in Venezuela. It's happened to lesser extents in Ecuador and Peru. It's tragic. It's not a path we want to go down. The Weimar Republic in World War I and World War II in Germany is another example. It's a disaster. We don't want to do this. The big question is, when exactly does that monetary fiscal nexus break down? If the Fed is monetary and Congress is just spending willy-nilly without any kind of discipline, then sooner or later things are going to go very badly. And this is an extreme version of something that now, and that's the idea that low interest rates will persist. Jason Furman and Larry Summers, both eminent economists, have been making this case. The claim is essentially that global interest rates have been massively, and there's no reason to think that that won't continue. The markets don't predict it. There's no evidence, that kind of thing. So let's step back and understand a little bit why this happened. There's been some good work. I think Ben Bernanke have talked about how the global savings glut, and think of savings as loanable funds that can be loaned out to companies to invest, people to borrow generally, that has increased. It has increased faster than the investment opportunities to absorb that and keep interest rates at a higher level. So that's led to the global interest rates declining. Why has there been an increase in global savings? It has to do with the emergence of a global middle class. China, to a lesser extent, India, lots of places that used to be desperately poor. Think the former Soviet Union, think much of Africa, much of Eastern Asia, even Latin America. People have become a lot wealthier during a period of their lives when they're in their prime working years. But the global growth rate, the population growth rate, is slowing. People are having fewer children. As a result, populations are aging. This is especially true in China because of their disastrous one-child policy, but it is throughout the world on average. The global population is net aging. And so we can expect to see a reduced growth in the savings rate going forward. There's a book that's been out recently by an economist, Professor Goodhart, and his co-author, Pradhan. He's with, I think, a macro consultancy. And then you combine that with better business climates. The World Bank has this Doing Business report, and they track how easy it is to start and run a business, mostly targeted at small and medium businesses. But what you see is that in massive economies, places with 1.4 billion people, both China and India, have both improved by about 20 points on a 100-point scale over the 5 to 7 years. We don't have the latest report out yet, but that is an enormous improvement in the business climate. We should expect increased demand for capital from that. Either one of those, the aging of the populations and the reduced savings growth, better business climates leading to greater demand for loanable funds, would have a tendency to increase the interest rates. We're going to be expecting both, and not like in the distant, like a couple decades from now. Some people believe that this is already happening. It's just masked by the incredible shock that we're experiencing in the pandemic. So I'm very worried about this. I think everyone should be. Back to the fiscal stuff. Even once we get past this pandemic, we're going to have these big imbalances. This is the difference between spending and revenue as a percentage of GDP. You see that revenue is projected to 17.8% of GDP, spending back up to 23% and continuing on from there. That gap is the deficit. Well, that gap plus the net loans that the federal government provides, especially through student loans, is what adds to the debt. So unless we can close that gap somehow, this debt trajectory. This kind of breaks it down, like what's responsible for that. You can see that over time, discretionary spending, the two orange colors down at the bottom, that has declined and will continue to slowly decline as a percentage of GDP. Other mandatory, which includes things like federal civilian and military retirement, some veterans benefits, food stamps, things like that, that is also projected to decline. Social Security spending is projected to increase fairly substantially, but healthcare and interest are the big things. Interest is kind of a result of the primary deficits that have built up over time. And so to reduce the interest costs, we have to have at least grow fastly at the bare minimum, but we really need to get to something like primary balance or ideally even full balance. But you can see that revenue is not going to be anywhere close to paying for all of the spending that is scheduled in current law right now. And that just gets worse over time. This is another way of looking at it. This is percent of GDP for different areas. Again, you can see that discretionary spending a little bump during the financial crisis and the Great Recession, but that's fairly stable in the future. Other mandatory spending, same story. Social Security goes up, but then it's fairly flat. It's net interest that are just taking off like a rocket, and that's what we've got to get under control. I mean, every little bit helps. We've got to do something everywhere, but that's the biggest challenge. This shows how the spending over the next 10 years from 2020 to 2030. This is in nominal terms, not as a percentage of GDP. So here you see that discretionary is growing, mandatory as well. Again, not as a percentage of GDP. The Affordable Care Act and Children's Health Insurance Program are growing a good bit faster, but it's really Medicare and Social Security especially. And they say that net interest will grow, but not by as much as those other things. If you look back from, I guess, the last 20 years, the main drivers of the debt growth over that time had to do with economic crises, the 2001 recession, 2008 one, the current one, which all, but it also increases spending on safety net programs. And then Congress has done a lot more in addition to that. The tax cuts over a period of time, there's been a number of rounds of these. Those have added to the deficit. Again, you may think that they make sense for other reasons, but if you're cutting deficit or cutting revenue without cutting spending, then you're really just the revenue impact. You're not actually reducing the tax burden. Certainly the wars were a significant expense, and they're going to have a long tail. Veterans requiring services from injuries they sustained for many decades to come. And then just increased appetite for discretionary spending. In the future, the major drivers, but the major factors will be the excess cost growth in healthcare, the aging of the population, and interest costs. And then some people would say that we don't have enough revenue, other people say we have too much spending, whatever the decision there is, there's a gap. So the result is the deficits are projected to explode in the long term. You can see those three scenarios we talked about before. This is the debt version of the same graph. This can't happen. It's literally unsustainable. At some point, this breaks within the next couple of decades. And if it goes faster, then possibly all faster. The longer we wait, the harder it is to fix. If we wanted to just kind of stabilize debt as a percentage of GDP, we would have to, starting in 2025, either increase revenue or decrease of 2.9% of GDP. That's a big, big change. If we wait till 2035, we've got to do 4.8% of GDP adjustment. That's huge. If we wanted to get back to 79% of GDP, where the economic harm from this debt is substantially less, and there'd be even less than that, then we're talking, somewhere between 3.6% if we're hitting that in 2025, and 5.9% if we wait all the way till 2035. So dealing with it sooner is better. The longer we wait, the more of the adjustment will take place on stuff that's easy to change quickly, hint, revenue. So we're much better off phasing in changes starting ASAP. We've got a bunch of trust funds that are expiring within the next 11 years. You can see, look at the green line, the Highway Trust Fund has been bailed out a couple of times. That's why that line increases. And it was on track to run out of money this fiscal year, but they bailed it out again a couple months ago. And so it's now 2022. Still, this Congress has to deal with that. The Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund is running out of money by the end of the next presidential term. The Social Security Disability Trust Fund, 2 years after that. And assuming that the Old Age and Survivors Trust Fund isn't rated to bail out disability, that's got until 2031. So these are crisis points. There are also opportunity points. Maybe we can get some reforms there. There are some things that have bipartisan support. There's, at least on certain examples of options within, supporting the economic recovery, whether that's, regulatory relief or something else. lowering healthcare costs. There have been some attempts to get a surprise medical billing. You guys have tons of ideas. Tax enforcement. I mean, there's a lot of people that owe taxes, but for a variety of reasons aren't paying what the law says they owe. So there's probably some enforcement that could happen there. The budget process is a disaster, and there's a lot of room for improving that. We'll get to that next slide. And then the trust funds. If we actually fully closed the gap between those 4 trust funds that I mentioned, plus the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation multi-employer, these are union retirement funds, then that would basically stabilize the debt. It'd be too high. It'd be too high of a level, but it would stabilize the debt. And it just shows you how important healthcare is, but also pensions are to dealing with the long-term debt situation. All right, this is my last substantive slide, and the next one is just sort of an FYI. The institutions matter. We got into this mess for a number of reasons, partly because there were pressures to do things, but there weren't enough counter pressures to be fiscally responsible. Individuals matter. Individuals have always mattered. But so does the institution, and it's that interaction between the two that really drive your outcomes. So what we're trying to do is anticipate the opportunities that may come up over the next couple, those that are expected and those that are unexpected. If we have a fiscal crisis, that changes the game pretty significantly. But we want to be ready so that these reforms are on the shelf and ready to go for whatever opportunities present themselves. So one is fiscal targets. I've written amendments and worked on implementing legislation for those. They could be full balance, they could be primary balance. Primary balance meaning you exclude the net interest costs, so you're sort of balancing revenue with current spending, not the legacy spending that is embedded in the debt service costs. You could target debt to GDP ratios, or you could do some sort of a even. The trick comes down to enforcement. How do you get Congress to write rules that it then lives by? When they make the rules, they can change the rules. Under the Constitution, the House and the Senate have plenary power to make their own rules for their own proceedings. And so it's looking at how to get them to be more disciplined and hold each other to better account. So there's political enforcement. There's a couple of different ways you can go there. There's automatic enforcement. We have that with the Budget Control Act caps, which were originally created under the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act, or also known as the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985, and then reaffirmed in 1987. We have that under the Statutory Pay-Go Act, or Statutory Pay-As-You-Go Act, originally of 1990, brought back in 2010. These are across-the-board cuts. They haven't worked very well, as we've seen. There may be ways of improving that so that Congress can sort of live with it and then be more likely to actually be fiscally responsible on the front end with things they're proposing. Another piece of enforcement might be, hey, you don't have to vote on the debt limit as long as you stick to whatever fiscal targets you set for yourself. And so pay-go restoration could be part of this. We think an automatic continuing resolution makes an awful lot of sense. So there's always this fight at the end of the fiscal year about how we're going to pay for things, how we're going to, keep the government going. And certainly there's different programs that different people don't support, and that's fine. But almost nobody supports a broad shutdown of the government. It's chaotic, it's disruptive, it creates blowback. And so an automatic continuing resolution, ultimately what that does is change the game from accept this bad deal that leadership has put together with the appropriations leaders, or you're going to be blamed for a shutdown. And then the new game is we're going to stick with the status quo unless we can figure out some spending package, some appropriations package that most of you prefer to the status quo. So it's a much more disciplined approach. There are lots of options with the conference rules, or the caucus rules. Republicans call them conferences. So it's the Senate Republican Conference, the House Republican Conference. Democrats call it caucus, so Senate Democratic Caucus, House Democratic Caucus. They have their rules. All of them, except for the Senate Democrats, have made them public. And there are lots of places where leaders sort of amplify their own power through those rules, which means they drive the agenda, and it makes it harder for members to sort of act independently, work across party lines, and try to fix problems. It really inhibits the committees from being able to move things that make sense without getting the majority leadership's explicit sign-off. have a number of opportunities for improving them, strengthening pay-go, improving transparency, all these little things. Like any given reform won't make a big difference. It's only a little bit on the margin, but if you start adding a bunch of these together, they can really change your trajectory. It's like turning the wheel on a big ship. It takes time, it takes sustained effort, but it can make a difference. There's a really interesting bill that's spearheaded by Senators Mitt Romney and Joe Manchin and Representatives Mike Gallagher and Ed Case. So it's bipartisan and bicameral. It's called the Trust Act. It would set up commissions, bicameral, bipartisan commissions to try to restore solvency to both sides of Social Security, the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, and the Highway Trust Fund. There'd be one commission for each of those programs. And so by focusing on that, hopefully they can make some progress. There are other fiscal commission ideas that have been tried and not been wholly successful in recent history. That's another option. Restoring Congress's Article 1 powers under the Constitution, including but not only power of the purse. There are other things that Senator Mike Lee has a great bill called the Article 1 Act that would discipline emergency designations and put it back under Congress's control, except for a brief period of time. But there's so much more that can be done. There's a bunch of legal gaps in the Constitution where the Constitution is fairly vague, and Congress could fill in a bunch of those gaps with implementing legislation, not only in the fiscal space, but like treaty powers, what does it mean, what is a high crime and misdemeanor, or lots of other things. In terms of the budget process overall, there's a huge difference between what the federal government does and what the states do. I call it peas and pudding because, in DC, it's nice to be colloquial. But at the state level, each of the typically the legislators will take that budget and then make whatever changes they think make sense kind of relative to that. But they have an integrated package that combines everything from the line items all the way up to the aggregates, or at least the aggregates are implicit within this, but they have level discretionary spending combined with direct spending or mandatory spending combined with revenue. They actually have, these are the revenues we're expecting, and then they sort of spend in some relationship to the revenues that are coming in. And so, if you need to make some adjustments to things, whether it's on the discretionary or the direct spending side, or whether it's on the revenue side, it's all kind of combined. So if you need to do some fiscal consolidation because of a downturn or your stuff is getting out of whack, then you've got the cover of saying, but look, I didn't like that stuff, but I really thought it was important that we fund education. We're talking about the state or police or whatever. This was sort of the price that had to be paid. At the federal level, the budget resolution has all the aggregates. The goodies are all in the appropriations legislation, which they're supposed to be figuring out right now. But then where do the P's come in? Where do you actually make those changes to direct spending and revenue provisions? Well, if you don't do budget reconciliation, and we only seem to do that when there's unified government, and we only seem to do that when we're increasing deficits, well, maybe we just don't eat our peas enough. But if you combine the peas and the pudding in some way, there's lots of different ways you could do it, then you might be able to get the cover of, well, I needed to support, our men and women in uniform, or I needed to support transportation spending or whatever. And I didn't love those changes we made over here to these mandatory health programs, but, we kind of need to do it anyway, but we really needed to fund defense. Like, those are the kinds of things that would change the incentives within the system in a healthy way. Useful to do is just take a holistic look at all the programs in a given subject area. The Senate Budget Committee recently released a report on housing programs. There's 100 and something housing programs spread across 20 or 21 different agencies that collectively pursue about 5 different missions. So why don't we consolidate that across, loan programs, spending programs, revenue provisions, and just streamline that and squeeze out a bunch of the duplication and waste. So those are some ideas. Working on, or working with a number of congressional offices on a number of things, and then of course there's plenty of other initiatives that are going on that we're not involved with, but we're aware of, and there's a lot of good stuff going on, but we need more of it. So if you want all of this stuff. Here's some of our websites, some external websites that are useful. We have some interactive tools. You know what? I meant to change the link from a Brookings product, the fiscalship.org, to the Cato one, but I didn't. So if you want to see what Cato is proposing on this downsized government website, then just Google it and it'll pop right up. So I guess at this point, do you want to open it up for questions, guys? Questions or discussion?
I was going to say, yes, let's do. And in fact, I was going to kick that right up by asking you, based on this recent election, what's your thoughts in terms of any of this coming to reality with that sweep of these 12 new Republican women coming on board and some of the rest of the new people that are showing up?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really exciting time, actually. So Yvette Harrell from New Mexico, she was involved with the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force for a long time. So she's definitely committed. Incoming Senator and former Representative Cynthia Lummis actually was a member of the CRFB board before she announced her run, and then she, obviously had to step down. But she's very much committed to fiscal responsibility. So yeah, some of the ladies cycle are just really impressive. Nancy Mace is another one, and I don't mean to disparage anyone that I'm not mentioning. There's a lot of talent out there, but there's also a lot of returning members on both sides of the aisle, Democrats in both the House and the Senate, that take fiscal responsibility seriously, are committed to working across the aisle. President-elect Biden, he has been involved with some of these efforts in the past. He was involved with the Simpson-Bowles Commission and a number of negotiations during his time as vice president and as a senator. And of course, the House and the Senate are very narrowly divided at this point. We don't entirely know what the control of the Senate is going to be until the Georgia elections are figured out. But, I think it's a promising time. And the important thing is to be prepared for opportunities. And what that means is to have credible legislation that has been drafted, has been vetted by committees of jurisdiction that have that expertise, has been shopped around with members ideally on both sides of the aisle, and certainly on both sides of the Capitol, just to lay the groundwork. I mean, sometimes there's some risk in putting things out publicly too early, but if these discussions are being had kind of in private, then, when the opportunities present themselves, then there's a real opportunity. I think another thing is that the Tea Party wave in 2011, that was fairly lopsided. That was a Republican push, and it was a reaction to unified Democratic control. But the thing that's different now is that Democrats have reacted in a similar way to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. They got very fired up about it. And then this last Congress, both parties have in some ways been showing their fiscal irresponsibility, and that may end up strengthening the hands of the more fiscally responsible members in both parties going forward, especially if the public, once we get past this pandemic, gets really concerned about the deficits and debt, which they tend to when they jump up, at least when there aren't other distractions like a president that, for whatever his merits, has been fairly polarizing, and pandemic that makes people more concerned about their jobs and their health and those of people they care about. So I think this next Congress, especially with the debt limit opportunity, can be really ripe for some productive reforms. Don't expect libertarian utopia, because that's not who's in Congress. That's not where the median voter is, but we could actually see some progress in the fiscal responsibility area.
Well, that's good news to hear then. Charles, I see your hand is up.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Kurt, for a great and thorough presentation. If any activist from this webinar would be inclined to help you get that bipartisan consensus going for doing something, because these entitlements are out of control. So many people we respect fear physical collapse if we don't get responsible. Who are the one or two or three or handful of legislators that you think will take the lead on this in the House or the Senate?
Well, I mean, I don't know that you can narrow it down that much. Like I mentioned, Senators Romney and Manchin, there are two that are involved with efforts like this, but you know, there's a whole bunch of other ones. Senator Lee and Senator Paul have good ideas. Senator Toomey has announced that he's not running for re-election, so that may liberate him to do more interesting things. I mean, I could probably name 15 members on each side of the aisle that, at least for different pieces of this, are very much worth engaging. So, I mean, even as an example, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, he's very committed to reforming the budget process, and he's worked very closely with Republican from Wyoming, Mike Enzi, on this. But he's a progressive, and so, you know, on things like climate change, he and Mr. Enzi see things very differently, at least from what I can tell. But there's some areas where they can work together, and then so it's really, there are a bunch of members that can be very productive in particular areas, and so you actually want that. You want to have a bunch of different champions, each pushing on their different things, so that you have a whole lot of options, so that when the opportunities present themselves, there's a robust menu of options that are out there that leadership can kind of pull from and members can coalesce around to try to get some of those things across the finish line when the time is right. So that's not a very satisfying answer in terms of like who are the people, but you know, it's just a matter of identifying who could be good on which area if they aren't already, and then working with them to move the ball forward.
I was going to say, Kurt, you know, when you said there's no libertarian utopia breaking out anytime soon, have you seen, since you've lived in the belly of the beast, as it were, any appetite at some point of trying to figure out how to get rid of Social Security in the, you know, transfer payment mentality, or is that like locked in to the deal and just need to figure out how to make it work?
And
therefore, like Medicare and all the kind of anything that ilk, you know, is there any way to get rid of any of that stuff, or we're stuck with it forever?
I think there are ways to eliminate duplication. Program that I talked, or the housing portfolio that I mentioned, I think there is some potential for some consolidation there. I would like to see a more robust focus on federalism and putting states in the lead. Canada, for example, basically has 3 block grants that they provide to the provinces. There's one for healthcare, there's one for a whole raft of social services, and then there's an equalization one where they basically take from the rich provinces and give to the poor provinces. Fine, but it's a block grant construct instead of the hundreds or maybe thousands of federal state relation programs that we have at this point. It's complicated. You don't know who to hold accountable for whatever annoying thing is happening with transportation or housing or education or whatever. And those should all be local, or more local than they are right now. On Social Security and Medicare, I think they are permanent and from a general perspective. I think they can be made to work a lot better. There are any number of tweaks. Social Security is probably easier to fix from a mechanical perspective. The options are much more well-known. Medicare and all health programs, frankly, there's a difference in visions between parties, and that's a little harder to get at, but there's some technocratic fixes. But they could be made to work a lot better. And that, from a liberty perspective, is worth doing. You know, getting part of the way to where you want to go is better than none of the way.
Yep. Well, Charles, I'm going to let you slip in the last question here, because lo and behold, we're getting to the end of the time here.
I think one big thing from your presentation, Kurt, is there are a lot of options you mentioned, which makes people realize it's not just about a balanced budget amendment. There are lots of more realistic solutions. That automatic CR sounds pretty good, you know, at least from my time as a congressional staffer back in the 90s, with all those shutdowns that killed us politically. That Article 1 bill Senator Lee has, you mentioned, that would reclaim for Congress some of the emergency powers, that seems to me relevant more so because of this past year, where both the presidents and state governors extended, you know, what some call draconian orders without any kind of legislative review or participation at all. Do you know anything more about that effort?
Well, it has broad bipartisan support. The Article 1 Act passed the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee. in 2019, I think mid-year 2019, and I think it passed by voice, and the only two members that said they would have voted against it were Republicans. I think it was they perceived as being critical of Trump in some way. And then leading Democrats have this Congressional Power of the Purse Act, and Title III of that is essentially the Article I Act. So there's really broad bipartisan consensus on that. And if it were brought up for a vote or tucked into the omnibus, then I think that it could get done and it would be a positive development. There's so much more to do. I haven't heard anyone other than me talking about it, but I would like to see that applied to the Stafford Act as well, because some of the things President Trump has done under the letter of the law in the Stafford Act are inconsistent with the intent of the Stafford Act. And so kind of reining that in would be good. I'm not familiar enough with the emergency provisions at state level to comment intelligently on that. But yeah, in general, there are a lot of emergency provisions that have developed over the years. Some of them at a very different time. The Cold War was a very different time for this country, and we've not revisited them to the degree that we need to. And then also, it's just there have been some changes to statutes as enacted. So there used to be a legislative veto for some of these emergency powers, but the Supreme Court said that no, you can't do that. You have to pass a new law. And so that upped the threshold from a simple majority of both houses, I believe, to 2/3 to overcome a veto. And as a result, it's basically gutted the applicability of that congressional check. So there is a real need for Congress, and probably for the state legislators too, to look carefully at these powers that exist in statute and see if they still make sense, and if they don't, to try to change them.
All right, very good. Well, that's a great way to end it for the day, and I appreciate you being here today, Kurt. And recall for everybody again is that if you get to the bottom of our marketplace site, you'll find the link where all these videos will be posted, and this video today will be posted on all 4 of these channels by the 1st of the week. So again, Kurt, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me.